10 years ago, 3 young adults vanished from their assigned cabin at Pine Hollow Summer Camp outside Mena, Arkansas, disappearing overnight from a place that was supposed to be controlled, supervised, and safe. It happened in 2014, after midnight, during the quietest stretch of the camp's summer season, when the forest usually held its breath and nothing moved but insects and wind through the pines. At first, authorities considered simple explanations: a late-night walk, a misunderstanding, a decision to leave together without telling anyone. But from the beginning, there were those who knew that explanation did not fit. The missing counselors were Mia Carter, 19 years old, Lily Beaumont, 22 years old, and Evan Brookshire, 20 years old. All three were night duty staff, responsible for monitoring cabins, responding to emergencies, and remaining awake while campers slept. They were not reckless teenagers chasing freedom. They were trusted, vetted, and repeatedly described as steady, cautious, and deeply aware of their responsibility. One senior camp administrator would later insist that none of them would ever abandon their post without alerting someone first. For nearly a decade, the disappearance of the Pine Hollow counselors would sit unresolved, suspended between rumor and paperwork, revisited only in anniversaries and whispered local conversations. Then, years later, an ordinary modern process, one that millions of people pass through without a second thought, would collide with physical evidence preserved from that night in the woods. When it did, it would force investigators to reopen a case most had quietly assumed would never move again. Before, Pine Hollow became synonymous with absence. It was known as a modest wooded summer camp nestled in the Wajita Mountains. In 2014, the camp was a patchwork of gravel paths, weathered cabins, and open clearings that smelled of sap and damp earth. Days were loud with children's voices and whistles. Nights were disciplined and calm, structured around counselor rotations and radio check-ins. Mia, Lily, and Evan had each arrived that summer for different reasons: college credit, seasonal income, a love of outdoor work, but they shared a seriousness about the job that set them apart. Mia Carter was in her first year away from home. Careful and observant, the kind of person who double-checked door latches and memorized camper allergies. Lily Beaumont, older and more experienced, had worked camps before and carried herself with quiet authority. Evan Brookshire balanced humor with vigilance, often assigned to the most restless cabins because he stayed alert and calm under pressure. Together, they formed an informal trio on night duty, covering overlapping zones and checking in with one another during long, dark hours. Their routines were predictable by design. Night rounds followed the same paths. Radios were tested at the same times. Lights were dimmed, not extinguished. The camp relied on that predictability to keep dozens of sleeping children safe. It also meant that anyone watching closely could learn exactly when paths emptied, when supervision thinned, and when the forest reclaimed its silence. In the days before the disappearance, nothing was officially wrong. No conflicts were reported. No threats were logged. But hindsight would expose small fractures, a lingering unease some counselors felt after dark, the sense of being watched near the tree line, the way sound carried too clearly in the still air. At the time, these were dismissed as nerves, the imagination filling gaps left by darkness. The last night Mia, Lily, and Evan were seen alive began like every other. By morning, their absence would unravel the camp, fracture a town, and leave behind questions that would echo for years until science, patience, and chance intersected in a way no one in 2014 could have imagined. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? Pine Hollow Summer Camp ran on structure, especially after sunset. In 2014, its layout was intentionally simple: a central gravel loop, clusters of wooden cabins spaced through pine and oak, a small administration building near the entrance, and staff housing set slightly apart from the children's quarters. The isolation was part of the appeal. Cell service faded quickly past the main gate. At night, the forest pressed close, swallowing sound and light. Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire lived in a narrow staff cabin designated for night duty counselors. Inside, the space was functional rather than comfortable. 3 single beds lined opposite walls. A small table held radios, flashlights, and a clipboard with handwritten checklists. A single window looked out toward a stand of trees, its screen slightly warped from humidity. The door faced the gravel path that led deeper into the camp, not toward the road. Their nights followed a steady rhythm. One counselor stayed inside monitoring the radio, while the others walked short loops between cabins, checking doors, listening for movement, watching for illness or fear that might pull a child from sleep. At the top of every hour, they logged their status. Missed check-ins were rare and taken seriously. The camp culture rewarded consistency and caution, not bravado. Lily Beaumont often anchored the rotation. At 22 years old, she had a calm authority that reassured younger staff. She kept notes on minor issues and followed protocol precisely. Mia Carter, 19 years old, was quieter but meticulous, often lingering a moment longer at each cabin to listen. Evan Brookshire, 20 years old, brought energy without carelessness, known for noticing small changes in routine or environment. Together, they balanced one another, covering blind spots by habit rather than instruction beyond the camp's internal routines. There were adults who moved through Pine Hollow without staying long enough to be remembered clearly. Maintenance workers checked water lines. Vendors delivered supplies during daylight hours. Occasional parents arrived late to pick up homesick children. Each visit was logged, but familiarity bred complacency. Faces blurred together over the course of a summer. The vulnerabilities were subtle but real. Several cabin doors relied on aging locks that stuck in humid weather. The back of the staff cabin sat in partial darkness after midnight, beyond the reach of the nearest lamp. The forest itself offered countless places to stand unseen, absorbing footsteps and muting voices. Counselors were trained to notice campers, not intruders. On the evening of the disappearance, the camp settled into its usual quiet. Dinner trays were stacked and cleaned. Children brushed teeth and climbed into bunks. Radios crackled with routine acknowledgments. Mia, Lily, and Evan reviewed their assignments and began their rounds. The air was heavy, warm even after dark, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil. There was no indication that any of them planned to leave their post. No bags were packed. No notes were left behind. Their personal items, wallets, phones, spare clothing remained in the cabin. The routines they followed were the same ones they had practiced for weeks, visible and predictable to anyone paying attention. As the night deepened, the camp grew still. Crickets and cicadas filled the spaces between footsteps. Cabin lights dimmed one by one. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the world beyond Pine Hollow continued as normal, unaware that 3 lives were moving toward a moment that would fracture that routine forever. The final day of Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire began without warning or wait. On the morning of the 18th of July 2014, the camp woke to heat already rising from the dirt paths, the kind that promised a heavy night ahead. Breakfast was served at 7:30 a.m. Campers complained about the humidity. Counselors reminded them to drink water. By 10 a.m., the lake was open, whistles echoing across the clearing as children ran barefoot over the dock. Nothing in the daylight suggested an ending. Mia spent the afternoon supervising crafts. Her clipboard balanced on one knee as she checked names and supply counts. Lily rotated between cabins, resolving minor disputes, steady and unhurried. Evan helped with evening games, laughing easily, but keeping one eye on the tree line as the sun lowered. By 6:45 p.m., dinner was underway. By 8:30 p.m., the sky had darkened to a deep, bruised blue. Cicadas already loud in the surrounding woods. Night duty began at 10 p.m. The counselors gathered in their cabin, checking batteries and flashlights, testing radios, confirming assignments. Logs later showed their first check-in occurred on time. The second followed without issue. The forest beyond the cabins was unusually still between bursts of insect noise, the air thick enough to feel against the skin. Light from the staff cabin spilled weakly onto the gravel, fading quickly into darkness. Sometime after midnight, a senior counselor in a nearby staff building half woke, stirred by a sound they could never fully explain later. It was not a voice, not a scream, just the sense of movement where there should have been none. A shadow, perhaps, crossing light. Footsteps where paths were usually empty at that hour. The moment passed quickly, smoothed over by fatigue. By morning, they would question whether it had been a dream at all. At 1 a.m., a routine radio check-in was missed. At first, it raised little concern. Radios failed. Batteries drained. A delayed response was not unheard of. By 1:10 a.m., another call went unanswered. By 1:20 a.m., the silence felt heavier, more deliberate. A flashlight beam swept across the gravel outside the staff cabin, illuminating nothing but stillness. When a counselor approached the door, it was unlocked. Inside, the room looked paused rather than disturbed. Beds were unmade but not ransacked. Radios sat on the table. Personal items were exactly where they should have been. There were no signs of preparation, no evidence of departure. Outside, the night swallowed sound, the forest offering no immediate answers. By 5:10 a.m., dawn crept through the trees, washing the camp in pale light. Campers began to stir. A counselor assigned to relieve the night shift walked the familiar path toward the staff cabin, expecting tired faces or routine handoff notes. Instead, they found absence. Phones rang unanswered. Names echoed down the path, unanswered by the woods. Panic unfolded in stages. First confusion, then fear, then certainty that something was wrong. Searches began at the cabin, spread to nearby paths, then outward toward the tree line. The radios crackled with fragmented updates. By the time the first patrol car turned onto the gravel road, the camp was already unraveling. The weight of responsibility settling heavily on those who had trusted the night to remain ordinary. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The siren cut through the morning air, sharp and unmistakable, marking the moment when a missing shift became a criminal unknown. Law enforcement arrived just after sunrise, the lights still thin enough to cast long shadows between the cabins. The Polk County Sheriff's deputy stepped out first, followed by the lead investigator assigned to the case, a local officer with years of experience handling missing persons, but no precedent for something like this. Pine Hollow was not a place where people vanished. It was a place designed to prevent exactly that. The first priority was containment. Camp administrators were instructed to keep children inside their cabins. Staff were gathered and accounted for. The counselor's cabin became a focal point, treated less like a living space and more like a paused moment in time. The investigator moved slowly, documenting before touching, aware that any assumption could become a mistake. Inside, each bed told the same story. Sleep interrupted, not concluded. Flashlights lay where they had been placed hours earlier. Radios were powered on, volume turned up, batteries intact. There were no packed bags, no missing personal items. Phones, wallets, keys, all remained behind. Whatever had happened, it had not been planned. Attention shifted outside. Just beyond the cabin door. In the soft dirt bordering the gravel path, a shallow scuff mark cut across the ground. It was not deep enough to suggest a struggle, but it did not belong to any routine foot traffic. Nearby, flattened grass indicated that someone had knelt or paused for several seconds, compressing the vegetation in a way that felt deliberate. A few yards farther into the tree line, searchers found the first personal item, a camp-issued flashlight. Its casing cracked, the lens smeared with dirt. It belonged to Mia Carter. It was logged, photographed, and bagged. The distance between the cabin and the flashlight was short, but enough to shift the working theory from confusion to intent. Footprints followed. At least one set was clearly adult-sized, deeper and heavier than those made by the counselor's camp-issued shoes. The tread pattern was partially preserved in damp soil, angling away from the cabin toward a maintenance road that cut through the woods. Plaster casts were made using the tools available at the time, imperfect but carefully labeled. By mid-morning, the search expanded. Volunteers from Mina arrived in waves, drawn by word of mouth and the presence of patrol cars. Dogs were brought in and worked the edges of paths, creek beds, and service roads. The forest was combed methodically, but it was vast, and the heat rose quickly, degrading scent trails with every passing hour. Back at the cabin, the investigator recorded statements. The senior counselor who had sensed movement during the night struggled to describe it, aware of how fragile the memory sounded. The account was documented anyway, noted without judgment, filed alongside diagrams and photographs. As the evidence accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. The absence of noise, the lack of disorder, the direction of the footprints. None of it aligned with three responsible adults deciding to leave their post together. The signs pointed outward, away from the cabin, toward the forest and beyond. Standing near the disturbed ground, the investigator paused, looking at the cluster of clues laid out on the hood of a patrol car: flashlight, footprints, flattened grass. In isolation, each could be explained away. Together, they formed a conclusion that settled heavily in the early heat. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not voluntary. By noon, the language surrounding the case had changed. What began as a missing shift was now being treated as something far more serious, something that would not resolve with a simple phone call or a late return. By the afternoon of the 18th of July 2014, the investigation had moved from the campgrounds to the Polk County Sheriff's Office in Mina. The transition marked a shift not just in location, but in mindset. Inside the station, maps of Pine Hollow were spread across tables. Photographs from the cabin and surrounding woods were pinned in sequence. Timelines were written, erased, and rewritten as deputies worked backward from the missed 1 a.m. check-in. The conclusion came quietly, without ceremony. Based on the evidence collected, personal items left behind, adult-sized footprints leading away from the cabin, and the absence of any signs of preparation, the case was formally reclassified. Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire were now considered victims of an abduction. It was a designation that carried weight, and one that no one in the room had wanted to make. Investigators began assembling a list of individuals with access to the camp and knowledge of its routines. Maintenance workers, seasonal staff, vendors, and former employees were identified and interviewed. The focus narrowed quickly on one adult male who had worked intermittently around Pine Hollow earlier that summer. He knew the layout. He understood the night schedules. Records showed he had been in the area during the week of the disappearance. The scrutiny intensified. His timeline contained inconsistencies. He struggled to account for his whereabouts during the early morning hours of the 18th of July. Search warrants were executed. His footwear was examined. Several days. Attention centered on him as the likely answer to an otherwise incomprehensible event. Then the evidence failed to cooperate. shoe tread comparisons did not match the impressions found near the counselor's cabin. Cell records placed him miles away during the critical window. A corroborated account from a third party confirmed his location during the time investigators needed him to be near Pine Hollow. Slowly, reluctantly, he was eliminated as a primary suspect. The case did not collapse, but it lost momentum. The search continued. State resources were brought in. Additional dogs were deployed along service roads and waterways. Helicopters scanned tree canopies and clearings. Investigators explored the possibility of a vehicle waiting beyond the maintenance road, but no reliable sightings emerged. There was no ransom demand, no credible tips, no witnesses who could place an unfamiliar person inside the camp after dark. A review by outside agencies noted the same unsettling detail. The abduction appeared controlled. Whoever took the counselors had done so quietly, efficiently, and with confidence in the terrain. It suggested planning. It also suggested someone who would not be easily found. As days turned into weeks, the tone of the briefing shifted. Family members and friends clung to hope, measuring time in hours and then days without sleep. Camp staff carried guilt they could not articulate, replaying routines and wondering what they had missed. The lead investigator returned to Pine Hollow repeatedly, walking the paths in silence, trying to see the night as someone else had seen it. Eventually, the reality became unavoidable. Without new evidence, the investigation could not move forward. The files were organized. Evidence was labeled and sealed. Reports were finalized. The case was transferred from active investigation to inactive status, a procedural step that felt anything but procedural to those who had lived inside it. The box containing the names Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire was marked with the year 2014 and placed on a shelf among others that carried similar weight. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The searchlights went dark. The roads through Pine Hollow returned to gravel and quiet. But the questions did not disappear. They simply waited, sealed inside a box, for a future moment when the past would refuse to stay buried. Time passed in ways that felt uneven. In Mena, Arkansas, the years after 2014 reshaped Pine Hollow summer camp without ever fully erasing what had happened there. New coats of paint appeared on cabins. Old counselors aged out and moved on. Children who once slept through that summer grew into adults who remembered the camp only as a place their parents stopped sending them. Inside the Polk County Sheriff's Office, the case aged differently. The box labeled with the 3 names moved as the department did. It was shifted during renovations, relocated when storage rooms were reorganized, briefly flagged during a digitization push that prioritized newer cases. At one point, a leaking roof forced staff to relocate several shelves of older files. The Pine Hollow box was saved almost by accident, pulled free before water reached the cardboard. Inside were the remnants of urgency. Photographs curled at the edges. Evidence logs typed and retyped, plastic bags holding items that once felt warm in someone's hand. Mia's cracked flashlight. Soil samples scraped from a path no one walked anymore. Plaster casts of footprints that had never found their match. The senior counselor's uneasy nighttime memory, carefully transcribed and quietly doubted. The lead investigator retired in 2018. Before leaving, he walked the storage room one last time, fingers trailing across spines of unsolved cases. He paused at the Pine Hollow box longer than the others. In later years, he would admit that it never left him. 3 responsible young adults, taken without noise, without explanation, from a place designed to protect them. Outside the department, the families learned how to live with absence. Birthdays passed without candles. Holidays shifted shape. Some relatives kept bedrooms intact. Others packed things away, believing it was the only way to breathe. There were moments of renewed hope when rumors surfaced, when a tip arrived from another state, when a stranger was reported who vaguely resembled one of the missing. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. The camp itself became a quiet witness. Paths grew in. Trees thickened. Where searchers once stood shoulder to shoulder, deer now moved unbothered. On some nights, staff reported an unease they could not explain, a sense that the forest remembered something they did not. Those feelings were never formalized, never written down. Elsewhere, beyond Arkansas, lives unfolded under different names. The system gaps of the mid-2010s allowed for long shadows. Records were still fragmented. Databases did not always speak to one another. Unless someone went looking with intent, it was possible to move forward, carrying a past that no longer officially existed. Somewhere, far from Pine Hollow, the echo of that night continued in ways no one at the camp could see. Years passed. Then more. By the early 2020s. The Pine Hollow case was rarely discussed outside anniversaries and internal reviews. It was listed as unresolved, inactive, cold. But it was not forgotten entirely. It survived because of preserved evidence, because of careful labeling, because someone years earlier chose not to discard a box that took up space and offered no answers. And then, quietly, the conditions changed. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. Old evidence, once limited by the tools of its time, waited patiently for a system capable of hearing what it had been trying to say. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The box remained on the shelf, closed and silent, unaware that it was closer than ever to being opened again, not by memory or rumor, but by a machine that did not forget. By the time the system finally noticed, nearly a decade had passed since Pine Hollow went quiet. In another part of the country, far removed from the Washido Mountains, an adult living under an unremarkable name sat in a sterile office and complied with a routine requirement. The process was administrative, procedural, stripped of emotion. Forms were signed. An ID was scanned. A biometric sample, fingerprints, later supplemented by a DNA swab, was collected without comment. It was the kind of step taken millions of times a year, rarely remembered once completed. For the person providing it, there was a familiar but unplaceable unease. Life under the assumed identity had always carried that weight. Records existed, but they never felt solid. Early documents appeared late, as if created to fill a gap rather than record a beginning. Details shifted depending on who asked. Dates were close but not exact. Places were vague. Teachers, employers, and minor officials sometimes paused, sensing something incomplete, but there was never enough cause to challenge what was presented. Systems did not talk to one another. Questions dissolved under routine. Memory behaved strangely. There were flashes that did not belong to the life on paper. The smell of pine at night, the sound of gravel underfoot, the weight of responsibility toward unseen others. Dreams repeated themselves without context, wooden walls, radios crackling, a sense of being counted on. Waking always brought confusion rather than clarity. The biometric sample entered a modern database designed to do one thing exceptionally well: compare. Within seconds, algorithms scanned millions of records, matching patterns invisible to the human eye. One comparison did not belong. The system flagged a hit. Stored within the database was trace evidence preserved from a July 2014 crime scene in Polk County, Arkansas. Biological material collected from an object recovered near Pine Hollow summer camp. At the time, it had been carefully logged and then effectively frozen by technological limits. Now, it spoke. The match was strong, statistically undeniable, enough to trigger an automated alert and reopen a file that had not been touched in years. A notification appeared on a cold case investigator's screen. unremarkable in appearance, but seismic in implication. 3 missing counselors. 1 unidentified biological trace. A living adult whose biometrics align perfectly with evidence from the disappearance. The investigator pulled the tintold Pine Hollow box from storage the same day. Inside were the names Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire, preserved exactly as they had been written in 2014. Photographs, logs, evidence tags. The investigator understood immediately what the system was suggesting, even before the conclusion felt real. This was not a suspect match. This was an identity match. The implications spread outward quickly. If the biometrics belonged to one of the missing counselors, then at least one of them was alive. If one was alive, the story told for nearly a decade was incomplete. And if the story was incomplete, then the past was about to force its way into the present. The investigator leaned back, absorbing the weight of it. 3 young adults taken in silence. 1 now found by chance, not by search. The system had done what years of human effort could not, bridging time with data and patience. The next step would be the hardest. 1 yet. Someone would need to be told that their life was not what they believed it to be. The cold case investigator approached the Pine Hollow file the way they approached every dormant case. Slowly, deliberately, with respect for the people who had carried it before. But this time, the weight was different. This was no longer an exercise in naming a perpetrator or reconstructing a vanished moment. This was about restoring an identity that had been buried. For nearly 10 years, every item from the box was re-examined under modern light. High resolution scans were made of photographs taken in 2014, enhancing details that had once been little more than shadows. Soil samples collected from the disturbed ground near the counselor's cabin were sent to a lab capable of mineral comparison. The results tied that soil, not just to Pine Hollow, but to a narrow band of service roads and work sites in the region areas, accessed almost exclusively by contracted adults, not staff counselors. The cracked flashlight recovered that first morning was revisited. Modern touch DNA analysis pulled biological material that earlier methods could not isolate. It matched the same biometric profile that had triggered the alert. The conclusion became unavoidable. The trace did not belong to an intruder or an unknown suspect. It belonged to one of the missing counselors. Attention shifted to reconstructing who had been present. Unseen, on the night of the 18th of July 2014, digital archives replaced paper guesswork. Utility records, contractor logs, and temporary work permits were cross-referenced against the camp's schedules. 1 name resurfaced, not as a suspect this time, but as a constant. An adult with access to the grounds, familiarity with night operations, and no reason to draw attention to their presence. The tread pattern from the plaster casts was digitally enhanced and compared against occupational footwear databases. The results pointed toward a specific type of work boot, common in maintenance and infrastructure roles. The timeline aligned. So did the access points. So did the quiet confidence suggested by the abduction itself. The investigator built a merged chronology. The counselor's final check-in, the movement toward the maintenance road, the adult's documented presence in the region, and the abrupt appearance of new identity records shortly afterward. Each data point reinforced the next. What had once felt like coincidence hardened into structure. Administrative records revealed the final truth. The adult linked to the abduction had died several years earlier. No confession, no charges, no trial, but enough evidence remained to name them officially as the primary offender, to place responsibility where it belonged, even if justice in the traditional sense was no longer possible. With the offender identified, only one task remained. The investigator prepared to contact the person whose biometric data had reopened the case. The message was framed carefully, stripped of accusation, anchored in fact. It explained that evidence tied them to a missing persons case from 2014, that further testing was required, that answers were possible. When the meeting finally took place, it did not begin with names or accusations. It began with dates, locations, and an explanation of how systems sometimes uncover truths no one is actively seeking. The investigator watched as understanding arrived slowly, not as a revelation, but as a series of small recognitions, stacking into something undeniable. The past had been reconstructed. Now it had to be returned. The confirmation came in layers, not all at once at first. The person sitting across from investigators struggled to hold the information in place. The idea that their biometrics aligned with a missing person case from 2014 felt abstract, almost technical, until the names were introduced in full. Maya Carter, Lily Beaumont, Evan Brookshire. 3 counselors who vanished from Pine Hollow Summer Camp in Arkansas nearly a decade earlier. 3 lives frozen in time. The realization did not arrive as disbelief, so much as recognition. Fragments that had never settled suddenly found edges. The forest smell that surfaced in dreams. The persistent sense of responsibility toward people whose faces could never quite be seen. The unease around official forms and questions about origins. What had once felt like personal instability reframed itself as interruption. Investigators explained, through summarized narration and documentation, that the biometric match strongly suggested the person before them was one of the missing counselors, living under a false identity since 2014. But suggestion was not enough. Science would have to close the distance between suspicion and truth. DNA samples were collected from surviving relatives connected to Pine Hollow. Family trees were reconstructed carefully, accounting for age, timing, and loss. In the years since the disappearance, some parents had aged visibly under uncertainty. Others had died without answers. Siblings and extended relatives stepped forward quietly, offering blood not out of certainty, but out of hope. The results were decisive. The DNA established direct biological relationships, consistent with one of the missing counselors. The match was not distant or statistical. It was immediate, intimate, undeniable. The person who had lived for years under an imposed identity was, in truth, one of the young adults taken from Pine Hollow. In July 2014, the reunion unfolded without spectacle. When family members finally met the person they had last seen as a teenager or young adult, they searched instinctively for continuity. They found it in small details, the shape of a smile, the way hands moved while explaining something, a familiar impatience with silence. Memories surfaced cautiously, triggered by objects and places rather than direct recall. A scar remembered but never explained. A habit formed before disappearance and carried unknowingly into adulthood. Joy existed alongside grief. Relief collided with anger. The years in between could not be recovered, only acknowledged. The missing counselor faced the task of integrating 2 lives, the one taken and the one constructed without consent. Family members faced the reality that the person they mourned had grown older without them, shaped by experiences they could never share. The cold case investigator updated the file, changing its status from unresolved to resolved. It was an administrative act, but not a final one. The paperwork could conclude, but healing could not be scheduled or guaranteed. Truth had arrived late, and its weight would take time to settle. For the first time since 2014, the Pine Hollow case carried an answer that could not be erased. Identity had been restored. The silence that followed was different, now no longer empty, but full of consequence. With the identity restored, the case could finally be closed in the only way left available to it. Official records were amended to reflect what the evidence now made clear. The disappearance of Mia Carter, Lily Beaumont, and Evan Brookshire was formally reclassified as an abduction under the language used in 2014. One adult was named as the primary offender, their role supported by forensic analysis, access records, and the reconstructed timeline. Their death years earlier meant there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no public accounting in a courtroom. Responsibility was documented, not performed. Questions remained, and always would. Investigators could infer motive only in fragments. Opportunity, access, familiarity with routine, the ability to move unnoticed. There was no surviving explanation for why 3 counselors were targeted, or why only one identity ultimately resurfaced through modern systems. Whether the others met different fates or whether evidence simply failed to survive could not be resolved with certainty. The file acknowledged those gaps without attempting to fill them with speculation. The early investigators were re-examined not with blame, but with context. In 2014, tools were limited. Databases were fragmented. DNA technology existed, but not in the form that could have connected a quiet trace on a flashlight to a living person years later. Evidence preservation, careful logging, and restraint in disposal were what made resolution possible at all. Without those choices, the truth would have remained unreachable. The case underscored the importance of listening closely to early witnesses, even when their accounts feel fragile or incomplete. The uneasy memory of movement in the night, written down and preserved rather than dismissed outright, became part of a larger mosaic that eventually made sense. Vulnerable perceptions mattered, even when they could not yet be proven. For the victim whose identity was returned, justice did not arrive as punishment or spectacle. It arrived as naming, as the quiet correction of a life story that had been forcibly rewritten. The restoration of a name, a place, and a history that could now be spoken without fear or confusion. For the families and the community, closure came not as relief from grief, but as transformation of it. The absence that once had no shape now had edges. The past, though still painful, could finally be understood. Truth did not come in time to save years already lost, but it came in time to matter. It changed how a life was recognized, how a crime was remembered, and how a community understood what had happened in the woods outside Mena, Arkansas's Dot. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.